Well, now we'd like to begin session 7-1. I'd like to now give the floor to Mr. Daniel Collins, who is the moderator of this session.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to this morning's panel discussion entitled Advancing Human Rights in the DPRK through a Dual Approach of Accountability and Engagement. My name is Daniel Collins, Human Rights Officer at the UN Human Rights Office in Seoul, and I'll be moderating this morning's discussion. In the past, both the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the DPRK have pursued a dual approach of engagement and accountability to try and advance human rights in the DPRK. This dual approach consists firstly of monitoring and documenting human rights violations and exploring all avenues for accountability, which include preserving information and evidence for possible future prosecutions under international criminal law. Alongside this approach runs efforts to secure constructive engagement with the DPRK government, seeking to involve DPRK government officials in human rights trainings and workshops with the hope that this can lead to more substantive collaboration on securing meaningful legal and institutional reforms to improve the situation of human rights. This morning's panel discussion will take a look at this dual approach through the experiences and views of our panelists. It will consider the logic of this approach, reflecting on some of its successes, failures, and challenges. And it will hopefully provide some fresh thinking on how to take this approach forward in working for improvements to the situation of human rights inside the DPRK. On this morning's panel, we have some eminent guests here to consider this topic of discussion. Firstly, we'll be hearing from Mr. Imesh Pokharel, the acting head of the Human Rights Office here in Seoul. Then we welcome the new Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the DPRK, Ms. Elizabeth Salmon, who is here in Seoul on her first mission since taking up the mandates on the 1st of August. On the line from the United States is Jérôme Sauvage, the former head of the UN presence in the DPRK from 2009 to 2013, and who also headed the UN Development Programme in country. Joining us here is Professor Bum-Suk Baek of Kyung-hee University, who will provide some thoughts on how a dual approach also needs to be integrated into the wider peace, security, and development agenda. And then finally, joining us online in Seoul, we'll hear the thoughts of Ms. Eun Kyung-kwon, who is an experienced activist advocating for human rights and democracy in the DPRK. So each presentation will be a maximum of 15 minutes. It can be shorter, which will give more time for discussion. So let's begin with the thoughts on the dual approach from Mr. Imesh Pokharel.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I would like to welcome everyone to this panel on promoting and protecting human rights in the DPRK through a dual approach of accountability and engagement. I would like to thank Elizabeth Salmon, Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the DPRK, Jérôme Sauvage, former UN Resident Coordinator in the DPRK, Professor Bum-Suk Baek of Kyung-hee University, and Eun Kyung-kwon, who is also joining us online for participating in this panel discussions. Dan has updated on some of the approach that we are taking within our office for the last many years. Particularly, the office has been pursuing a dual approach of advancing both accountability and, in the meantime, looking into various avenues to engage with the DPRK. I'll slightly elaborate on that and also talk about a bit of limitations and also some of the questions that we all have to answer in today's forum. As you know, the office has been monitoring and documenting and reporting human rights violations in the DPRK since establishment, and the UN itself even prior to the establishment of the OHCHR office in Seoul. We have a dedicated accountability team who are analyzing informations, engaging with stakeholders to identify various avenues for accountability, and as you all know, we publish both thematic and periodic reports on the human rights situation in the DPRK, primarily to provide visibility, but also to ensure that the issue of the human rights issues is visible to the international community. We also have information and evidence repository, which is basically storing all the information in one place for future truth, justice, and accountability processes. Since this year, we have been undertaking consultations with victims and stakeholders, primarily to reach out to them, but also to understand what do they understand by accountability, human rights, and what would be their suggestions on how human rights can be improved in the DPRK. As I basically say, it's also shifting the discussions from more experts-based discussions to victims and affected communities-based discussions. So we are undertaking that consultations since this year to involve victims and their families in identifying the best approach in dealing with the DPRK in terms of improving human rights. In terms of engagement, again, the office in Geneva is primarily involved in that process, and we have regular engagement with the DPRK missions. Some of these engagements, we know that it's not easy, but we want to have that sustained engagement just to keep talking and to have that conversations ongoing. We did have a capacity building program in 2019, and wanted to follow up with similar programs, but that has not been possible, although we had expected things to move, but also due to COVID-19 restrictions, that has not been possible. But we will continue to engage with the DPRK as much as we can, and expect that the DPRK would also be interested in terms of engagement with the office. We all know that the opportunities of engagement and both accountability, pursuing accountability, we have limited options. And if you see at a broader level, the UN engagement, particularly with the DPRK, has been through the United Nations systems in the country, through humanitarian support programs, and also DPRK has engaged with UN human rights mechanisms, particularly the Universal Periodic Review, with some treaty bodies, and also with some special rapporteurs, although it's only the special rapporteur on the disabled rights of the disabled persons. But at least we understand that DPRK is committed to the engaging with the UPR mechanisms and some treaty bodies. Of course, there are questions about the implementation status of some of the recommendations and whether there is a genuine willingness within the DPRK to improve the human rights situations. But keeping that aside, we can at least say that the DPRK is committed to some of the broader UN mechanisms. Also, the DPRK SDG's commitment can be viewed as a part of their interest in engaging in human rights. On the accountability, I think, again, there is limitations. We have the civil society organizations, UN, the Special Rapporteur has been monitoring, and even few member states has been monitoring, documenting, and reporting. This has been important to provide visibility and to push the accountability agenda. But even documentations and monitoring has been very, very hard because of the very few numbers of people from the DPRK coming and the country being completely shut down for the past few years. Some of the member states does have sanctions regimes to pursue accountability, but that's also very limited in scope until now. The Human Rights Council and the General Assembly has continued to adopt resolutions on the seriousness of the human rights situation, but in terms of real changes, we have not seen much, and the civil society organization and the victim's family has brought civil cases in the courts. However, again, pursuing those cases has not been easy either. So the chances, one of the major recommendations from the COI has been referral of the situation to the ICC, but the ICC initiating an inquiry or the referral, or the member states agreeing to a referral of the DPRK situations, at least in this current political climate, doesn't seem that feasible. There are also efforts on universal jurisdictions and to bring cases, but that's also still not happening, at least until now. So I just want to highlight that both engagement and accountability options are very hard and to pursue. Although we are doing limited activities in that regards. And one of the major limitations is the DPRK is a unique country where access to people or access to DPRK is almost completely limited, and it's in complete isolations, and diplomatic engagements has remained limited in the near future. And that is also one of the things that I have noticed personally, is there is also a clear division amongst the major actors and stakeholders even amongst governments, within political parties, within civil society organizations on which approaches is the best way to improve human rights in the DPRK, and either of the groups, the one which are pursuing constructive engagement and the one who are working on accountability, do not necessarily, whether it's political parties or CSOs, or other groups, do not necessarily interact or engage to see common areas where they can pursue both the approaches. And as I said, these divisions are very, very high, and sometimes it can get political also. We all know that both approaches has merits and shortcomings, and there is a need for all of us to optimize both the approaches to bring improvements in the human rights situations. There are a lot of questions we need to ponder upon, and I think this is a good forum to discuss those questions. And I think the basic one for today is pursuing accountability and engagement with the DPRK mutually exclusive, or can both approaches be pursued concurrently? I think we need to look into the objectives of both accountability and engagement. What do we exactly want out of these approaches? As an office, we have been saying that we want to ensure that there is no impunity and the perpetrators of the human rights violations are punished for their crimes, and victims have at least justice and reparations. That's why we want accountability, and similar human rights violations doesn't repeat in future. But if you look into the objectives of engagements, some of that also overlaps. Although we want to build trust and cooperation through dialogue to improve the human rights situations, we also want to establish a system that addresses the past and provide justice to the victims. We also want to use the examples of the past to improve the future rights situation. So there are definitely overlapping objectives in both accountability options and in engagement. Other important questions I think we need to answer, or we need to discuss among ourselves, is how do we ensure that the victims are central to in both engagement and accountability approaches, and that all these approaches doesn't become only engaging with the government or only targeting the government. So that's another question. One of the questions which I already hear is, supporting human rights agenda means jeopardizing humanitarian access. Is that the case? We have to discuss that. Does engagement means giving legitimacy to all the atrocities? Is it turning a blind eye? Are there areas like separated families, prisoners of war, or protection of specific groups which could provide opportunity for us to engage as well as to seek accountability? And what are the synergies in terms of the peace process and engagement and accountability, and also in our work on both humanitarian development as well as human rights advocacy? So these are some of the questions that we will have to look upon, and at least both all groups which are supporting engagement as well as accountability have to come together and find a, I wouldn't say solution, but I would say at least try to understand what can be done in a more practical manner where both approaches are feasible and each groups can support each other. I will stop it here. I am pretty sure during the sessions we will hear from the experts here on how what their advices would be, as well as learn from their experiences. And I look forward to hearing their views and suggestions, as well as from the forum itself, questions as well as suggestions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Imesh, for helping to set the context and to lay out some of the challenges and previous experiences. So next we'll turn to Special Rapporteur Elizabeth Salmon. In the midst of her first visit to the Republic of Korea since taking up her mandate on the 1st of August this year. She could potentially be on the mandate for 6 years, but that relies on being re-elected each year, or the resolution in the Human Rights Council. But so any initial thoughts that you have since taking up the mandate on this dual-track approach? We'll be very interested to hear from you. Thank you.
Well, good morning to all of you. Good morning, Professor Beck. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Dear Imesh and Daniel, thank you very much. In this short address, I wish to present an outline of the trajectory of the Special Rapporteurship on the situation of human rights in the DPRK, and of the current difficulties and possibilities to make significant progress on its mission 18 years after its creation. As you know, this mandate was established in 2004, renewed yearly, and in 2022. The functions that the mandate include is the establishment of direct contact with the government and with the people of the DPRK, including through visits to the country and to investigate and report on the situation of human rights, and the government's compliance with its obligations under international human rights law. Secondly, the mandate has the responsibility to seek and receive credible and reliable information, including through visits to the country from all relevant actors, including governments, non-governmental organizations, and any other parties who have knowledge on these matters. And third, the obligation to submit regular reports to the Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly on the implementation of the mandate, including on the follow-up efforts made in the implementation of the recommendations of the Commission of Inquiry. Through this time, the efforts of the previous special rapporteurs have been somewhat limited by the state parties' refusal to cooperate with international mechanisms. In this context, it might be useful for this mandate to discuss the following statements to determine to what extent they are valid. I'm not going to mention the state, of course. First, country-specific resolutions and mandates serve no purpose if the governments concerned do not recognize them. This was said in 2012. And I have another one. Second, the only genuine international cooperation based on objectivity, impartiality, and non-selectivity could effectively promote and protect human rights. This was said in 2014. Thus, I think that there is a consensus on the need for cooperation from the state party to adequately fulfill the Special Rapporteur's mandate. In this regard, the universal human rights system understands that an updated approach to the fundamental obligation of states parties to cooperate conveys that a state party to an international body must not only abide by the provisions of the treaty, but also cooperate with the organisms designed to monitor its compliance. Nevertheless, if the obligation to cooperate is undeniable, the fact remains that states party can resort to diverse arguments to avoid it. The relevant question is then if a country-specific mandate can make progress in that situation and how. Regarding the core mission of this mandate in this, again, 18 years of work between my predecessors and the government of the DPRK, it has become quite clear that, notwithstanding evident limitations due to lack of cooperation, certain important achievements have been obtained. Firstly, reliable and critical information has been gathered and presented in the state country reports. State parties and the international community have been constantly informed and updated through those reports on the situation of human rights in the DPRK, which allows them to be aware of the progress made in some areas and of the setbacks and the obstacles to make further improvements. Secondly, the engagement of the Special Rapporteur with the work of the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the DPRK, established by the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2013 and ended in 2014, deserves commendation. This document concludes, as you well know, that not only grave violations of human rights have occurred in the DPRK, but also crimes against humanity. These findings are relevant because they place on the agenda the possibility that high-ranking government officials could be investigated and tried by the International Criminal Court, specialized tribunals, or in national courts under the principle of universal jurisdiction. Thirdly, the overall work of the mandate has introduced a human rights approach, well, I think it's under construction, a human rights approach to the discussion about the imposition of sanctions and the reunification process. In this regard, it has become clear that any conversation about the denuclearization or the demilitarization of the DPRK, I think, must include a human rights perspective. Finally, although at this moment we still cannot examine the situation of the DPRK from the perspective of transitional justice, and it might be a matter for future discussions at what point transitional justice can be said to be taking place, this mandate proposes a long-term victims-centered dialogue regarding truth, reparations, and justice. Indeed, it must be acknowledged that Although the guarantees of certain rights, such as the right to truth and reparations, are often considered within the context of transitional justice, they can also be considered on an individual basis. Furthermore, certain experiences, particularly in Latin America, have shown that there is a possibility to design elements and institutions of transitional justice even while the humanitarian crisis itself is still taking place. Without stretching too far an analogy, as DPRK presents a quite different situation, it might be reasonable to consider whether the incorporation of elements such as truth, justice, and reparations could be possible in the DPRK present context. In sum, if it is completely true that the cooperation of the governments concerned is crucial for the ultimate success of any specific country mandate, the experience shows that there is still plenty of room to make progress through creative synergies, which include seeking for areas and topics where some understanding or cooperation might be built. This should never mean that a mandate can give up efforts to engage the concerned government in a relation of dialogue and cooperation. And the rapporteurship on human rights in the DPRK is committed to maintain those efforts. But alongside that difficult task, there are many other tasks, such as strengthening the prospects for accountability by hearing and recording witnesses and victims' accounts, highlighting and documenting critical topics such as the situation of women and girls, and the situation of detainees, and raising awareness among the international community about the need to seek protection and justice for victims of human rights abuses. I wish to emphasize, however, that the success of these partial efforts is possible only through the commitment of many different actors in the international community, such as governments who have a rapport with the DPRK's authorities, UN agencies, regional organizations, NGOs, victims associations, and the academic world, among others. All of them, well, all of us, should keep in mind the duty of international solidarity, which, according to the former independent expert on human rights and international solidarity, is the expression of a spirit of unity among individuals, peoples, states, and international organizations, encompassing the union of interests, purposes, and actions, and the recognition of different needs and rights to achieve common goals. In this country-specific mandate, it is the people of the DPRK who need the international solidarity and are entitled to it. If respect and protection of human rights is a shared goal, I think that it is also a shared responsibility. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for those thoughts and comments. I think there's much to discuss later on in the session. It's interesting how you talk about the fact that although the DPRK government is not engaging with the mandate, or indeed with the Seoul office, there are still opportunities for you to convene other relevant stakeholders in galvanizing energies to bring both progressive change, but also pursuing the accountability agenda at the same time. Next, we go over to Jerome Sauvage, who was the UN resident coordinator and UNDP representative in North Korea from the end of 2009 to early 2013. He led the UN in providing emergency and humanitarian support to the population in the DPRK, which involved negotiating with the North Korean counterparts on acceptable operating conditions in the country. Interestingly, he also secured the reopening of the United Nations Development Programme office in Pyongyang after 3 years of suspension, negotiating a new country programme for executive board approval, as well as being able to negotiate with the DPRK authorities on meeting the monitoring and evaluation requirements of UNDP. So he has lots of experience of successful constructive engagement with the DPRK authorities. Of course, currently there are no United Nations international staff inside of the DPRK due to the COVID-19 restrictions. So the hope is that UN agencies, including the World Food Programme, UNICEF, WHO, UNDP, will be able to return to the country as soon as possible with the freedom of movement necessary to carry out their respective mandates. So it will be fascinating to hear your insights, Jerome, into the possibilities and limitations of UN agencies working in country to support progress on the human rights situation. So, Jerome, over to you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you to the Office of Human Rights and to the Ministry of Unification for this meeting. I think I am picking up where Director Paccarel asked, engagement is very hard, and can we really engage without legitimizing the regime? And I am also following up, in a way, to Rapporteur Salman, who says that there is room for synergies, but all actors in the international community will have to participate. I am bringing the little piece of someone who has been doing engagement with a part of the regime, with the government, and who has had some limited experience with human rights in the country. Let me share my screen, if I may. I was indeed resident coordinator in North Korea from the end of 2009 to the beginning of 2013. My plan will be a presentation of the context, try to be specific about field-based engagement, and with whom. 3 concrete examples of progress and challenges, and finally, the way forward. 2 telling anecdotes as an introduction. When I arrived in DPRK as the new resident coordinator, I met the Danish ambassador who was on a visit, who asked me, what are you doing with your human rights responsibilities? And I answered at the time that I did not have, as resident coordinator, a formal mandate to address human rights. It was a sheepish response, a little bit of a shameful response. Things have slightly improved since. And the second anecdote is I once spoke with a DPRK official who himself brought up the issue of human rights-based approach to programming, which I must say honestly was a bit surprising. I will have a 3-point plan, whereas North Korea's context is not supportive. We still need to not ignore DPRK's human rights dimension, and the UN presence offers entry points. DPRK's context is not supportive. There is no clear mandate. The UN resident coordinator mandate is vague on human rights. It is at odds, human rights are sometimes at odds with the traditional humanitarian intervention doctrine. Field agencies would prefer not to mix politics with aid. It's also complicated. Field agencies must already navigate a complex environment and complex sanctions regime caused partly by the international community human rights concerns. It's risky. Past representatives in North Korea and elsewhere risk being persona non grata, unwelcome in the country for raising human rights issues. One cannot, however, ignore North Korea's human rights dimension. In fact, in North Korea, it is difficult to dissociate politics from aid. Visiting ambassadors and missions have asked me, what am I doing for human rights? agencies in North Korea must ensure that aid does not promote suppression of rights through diversion of aid, which is akin to taking away the right to food or the right to health. Executive boards enjoin agencies to provide only direct assistance to the people instead of the traditional capacity building of the state. And that is because of our funders' human rights concerns. So we cannot ignore the DPRK's human rights dimension, even in our daily work. And the good news, so to speak, is that the UN physical presence in the country offers entry points. I would say that the UN presence in North Korea is a paradox of size versus significance. The UN is one of the smallest aid programs worldwide in comparison to other developing countries. But it is the largest aid program to North Korea. There is no World Bank or IMF, Asian Development Bank, or an official European Commission office. The UN aid covers the whole country. UN Resident Rapporteur, I visited almost all the provinces of North Korea. The whole UN system tethers, attaches North Korea to the rest of the world through the General Assembly, civil aviation rules, climate change work, etc. So how do you turn this general relationship into specific actions? First, you have to ask for field-based engagement with whom? The UN resident coordinator can work with elements in the North Korean regime that, A, understand the need to stay within the United Nations, expect material benefits to North Korea from progress on human rights, and are willing to advocate inside their system for better engagement in human rights in front of the regime security system, the military, or the party. And that's an important point. We need to find the people we can talk to. Field-based engagement, what entry points? Well, the DPRK has signed some human rights conventions. The Conventions on the Right of People with Disability, CRPD, the International Conventions on the Rights of the Child, the International Conventions on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and others. There is the beginning of the human rights-based approach in programming. The initiative came along from former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who introduced human rights upfront to better coordinate between UN agencies' separate approaches to development, peace and security, and human rights. So these are the entry points that we can think about to initiate some kind of a practical discussion with the government. Example 1 of progress and challenges, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability. During my tenure, and I think it's been continued after, we organized a consultation on the benefit of CRPD with the National Korea Federation of People with Disability and with Handicap International. It included the disability component in the trainings of UN professionals, including North Korean professionals. UNICEF, UNFPA, and WHO jointly developed a curriculum for national health professionals working as community doctors and added protocols for health and rehabilitation of persons with disabilities. Also, it is a success that we inserted 8 questions on disability in the 2010 census that was funded by South Korea, Switzerland, and UNFPA. Now, there were challenges. The mainstreaming of disability rights in UN program is still very limited. Second example of progress and challenges in promoting human rights, data and international reporting. The progress was to have introduced data gender disaggregation, to have increased transparency. The DPRK government in 2011 issued its first SDG reporting, Sustainable Development Goals, which openly discussed inequalities. I can assure you that this took a lot of advocacy by the staff of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to disclose this information. They, I believe, took some risk and tried to convince other parts of the regime, of the government, of the other strong center of powers that they could issue this report. The challenge was that the UN agencies at headquarters were reluctant to accept the 2011 report due to the lower quality of data and analysis than in other countries. To date, in 2021, SDG voluntary national review report still does not meet international standards. The third example of progress and challenges in promoting human rights in engagement with the North Korean government is women's reproductive rights. The progress was what the United Nations, UNICEF, UNFPA, WHO worked in the areas of child and maternal health and advocacy for child rights, supporting the establishment of a comprehensive monitoring system and education for all in DPRK. What was the challenge? The program was more successful in addressing sexually transmitted disease or cervical cancer control than in advocating for a broad choice of contraceptive methods or a higher quality counseling for contraception, or by showing how to support women's rights and full participation in the workforce. I'm concluding my presentation in, not quite concluding, I'm sorry, the way forward. There has been some progress to an extent that, as Director Paccarel and Representative Salman has said, DPRK accepted to dialogue with UN bodies and UN resident coordinator to improve the human rights situations in the country and with humanitarian agencies to ensure the free and unimpeded access to all populations in need so that humanitarian aid is distributed transparently and reaches the most vulnerable citizens. Also, there's been the Universal Periodic Review on North Korea in May 2019 that produced 262 recommendations. Concretely, this progress showed in the new DPRK strategic framework, which is the document prepared by the UN resident agencies for their program, their four-year program. This time, a little bit like Mrs. Salman was mentioning, more integration was done. I will only read you the yellow sign parts because it will be too long. But the UN strategic framework says the goal is to address any inequalities and to reach the most vulnerable people, group and regions of the country. In the line below, you see on the left column the SDG 16, which are world goals, and on the right side, NDG, which is the national development goals. And they read like this: turn the whole society into a large and harmonious family through strengthening of people-centered Korean-style socialist system. So if you go behind the word, you see that there is an effort to sort of align with the SDG talk. And how does it translate concretely? Well, it's NDG 16.7, which you can read, that says, ensure that people take an active part in state administration and socio-political activities, fully exercise their political rights as masters of the state and society at all levels. Well, immediately we see the challenges in realizing HRBA and the SDG 16. When we read, to reach the most vulnerable people, groups, and regions of the country, my question as the resident coordinator will be, how do I reach street children, homeless people, persons held in detention centers and prison labor camps? Or when we read, ensure that people fully exercise their political rights as masters of the state and society at all levels, the question comes to mind, will we do election monitoring? Evidently, it will be a challenging exercise in both cases. In conclusion, what opportunities are today? The troubled international climate is a reality, and the indications are that there is a very serious impact on North Korea from its extreme isolation since COVID has started. we may find one of the worst situations in the last 3 decades in North Korea. There has been no UN appeal for funds since 2020 because there was no access, and if there's no access, there is no monitoring. In conclusion, whereas we need to return to North Korea, let's not miss an opportunity to rely on the UN resident coordinator system to implement in concrete ways a comprehensive dialogue linking development, humanitarian, peace, and human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerome, for that fascinating presentation. The strategic framework that you mentioned, I understand, has been extended to 2023. But obviously the UN international staff are not currently in country to implement that strategic framework. So as you mentioned at the end, the extreme isolation of the DPRK really creates perhaps bigger challenges than ever in terms of pursuing that constructive engagement approach. But I thought it was particularly interesting how you talked about engaging with the more progressive elements of the government and not treating the DPRK government as a monolith, but locating the progressive elements and supporting and working with those elements. Of course, at the best of times, we have around 40 international staff in country, but also, I understand, around 200 national staff working in those offices. So it's also through working with those national staff that progress can also be made. So thank you for those thoughts. The next presentation is from Professor Bum-Suk Baek, who is Associate Professor at Kyunghee University in Korea. Professor Baek is a member of the UN Human Rights Council Advisory Committee and has also served as an advisor to various government agencies and NGOs. So it will be particularly interesting to hear your perspective on the dual approach. So over to you.
Thank you, Daniel. I will speak in Korean. 안녕하십니까?
Good morning.
북한 인권 문제는 지난 5년여
So North Korea human rights issue, as it has been emphasized for the past 5 years, still needs a comprehensive approach that considers humanitarian assistance, investment, education, and exchange. But there is a clear reason that we must approach this issue with regards to changes from outside, like accountability and realizing justice and punishing those who are accountable. And there are still various opinions as to whether those two approaches actually contributed to improving human rights situation in North Korea, and their immediate effects, the assessment on their immediate effects are split as well. But in the long term, I believe that it is ideal for us to take these two approaches in a balanced way. We would have to resolve the North Korean human rights issue to realize justice and punish those who are accountable through a victim-oriented approach. But at the same time, we would have to make efforts to expose North Korea to outside. So for example, mother-child health, providing educational resources and medical supplies against diseases would at least partially expose North Korea's current status to the outside world. And the more we expand the contact surface with North Korea, I believe the higher the possibility for us to bring changes to North Korea. And what I just told you right now is something that I said 10 years ago at a North Korea Human Rights International Conference hosted by the Ministry of Unification in 2013. Now, the reason why I repeated my presentation from 10 years ago is because I believe it still is relevant today in 2022. And that is very unfortunate. To date, the policy, North Korean human rights policy of the Republic of Korea was not consistent, was not united, because human rights issue was linked with political issues. And North Korean human rights issues was politicized in the Republic of Korea or South Korea, that the discourse has been expanded and reproduced, and it has caused conflict within South Korea. So, for us not to receive criticisms anymore, perhaps what needs to be most emphasized today in 2022 is that we would have to seek practical and realistic measures to improve human rights issue in North Korea based on consistent human rights policies that are founded on international human rights norms. We would have to be actively involved in the global community's human rights activities against North Korea based on UN human rights mechanism at least. So for the past 3 years, various resolutions at the UN Human Rights Council and North Korea Human Rights, United Nations General Assembly has newly added or emphasized humanitarian issues like separated families, prisoners of war, and abductees. And at the same time, at the 49th meeting of OHCHR in March this year, there was a verbal report made, and according to that verbal report, the issue of accountability with regards to human rights violation in North Korea can lead to peace on the Korean Peninsula only when we realize the rights of victims to justice. And so this two-track approach of accountability and engagement has consistently been emphasized by the United Nations. Now let's look at this in detail. So if you look at the stance of South Korean government with regards to humanitarian assistance, we have always said that humanitarian assistance should continue regardless of political circumstances. However, as you well know, if we look at what has actually happened, depending on what administration is in power, the humanitarian assistance has always changed. Sometimes it will be in the form of free giveaway. Sometimes it would be based on principles. So, in other words, the South Korean government's humanitarian assistance was politicized. This is because both conservative and progressive governments of South Korea both dealt with this human rights issue and humanitarian assistance issue under the logic of national security. But I believe that we must take an integrated approach or adopt an integrated viewpoint that humanitarian assistance contribute to enhancing rights to food and social rights, and that human rights improvement itself is an important means to realize humanitarianism. And yes, we do admit that sometimes North Korea took advantage of these humanitarian assistance to achieve its political and military goals. And assistance through international organizations today follows strict and transparent standards. We monitor them, and they are provided in kind, not in money. And they are medical supplies and nutritious food for children that cannot be converted into military use. However, we still need to be mindful of the fact that only the selected few in North Korea are given these supplies. And these goods are also traded in North Korea market. Now let's move on to accountability. Now in 2005, the basic principles and guidelines on the right to a remedy and reparation for victims of gross violation of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law was adopted. And that actually talks about rights to justice, rights to compensation, and rights to truth. And it talks about what the basic rights of the victims are and the responsibility of the individual states to assure that right. So with regards to the rights to justice, it says that all nations are responsible for investigating into gross violations of human rights and humanitarianism, and when there are concrete evidences, it ought to be able to indict people who are responsible, and when they are found guilty, they need to punish them. And so this shows that the right to truth and understanding truth and disclosing these truths publicly is very important to the victims. So this victim-oriented approach, or the rights of the victims, are not abstract contents, but they're very concrete concepts, and they are established in International Human Rights Act. Now, even amid the humanitarian crisis in Latin America, they have still taken, and you said that even in other countries like Latin America, for example, we can still take approaches that are centered on the victims to ensure their rights to justice, compensation, and truth. And what I want to emphasize is that although a country may not be a primary violator of human rights, if victims who are in their jurisdiction have not been able to receive effective remedy, and if they still feel the pain of human rights violation, then the country has the responsibility to support them so that their rights to justice, rights to compensation, and rights to reparation and rights to truth can be guaranteed. And if the neighboring countries, if countries who are not primary violators have this responsibility, then so does South Korea, whose ethnicity is the same as that of North Korea. And unless we repair the dignity of the victims, human rights violation is not of the past but of present. If we look at North Korean human rights issue based on this very concept of human rights, the fundamental concept of human rights, we would have to remember the fact that humanitarian assistance and accountability, both of them are responsibilities of a nation and international community. And if human rights violation is a crime against humanitarianism, then we would have to look at human rights violation in North Korea not just as inter-Korean issue, but a universal international issue. And we would have to take more effective approach to this end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those thoughts. It was interesting to hear you talk about humanitarian assistance, and also to hear Jerome talk about the capacity development programs that he was trying to pursue while he was resident coordinator. Maybe Jerome, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
So there's obviously sometimes a tension between humanitarian assistance, which is responding to the immediate situation to alleviate suffering, and then the human rights-based approach, which is looking at the underlying causes. So this requires, the human rights-based approach requires developing the capacity of the DPRK state to fulfill its human rights obligations as the primary duty bearer. So for example, rather than receiving food aid, the DPRK state, the capacity should be built for the DPRK state to fulfill the obligation of people's right to food. Can you maybe just talk a bit about your experience of navigating with the executive boards in the United Nations in getting UNDP programs approved that were pointing more towards capacity development and some of the tensions that this caused in terms of the sanctions and also the need for the DPRK to fulfill its own human rights obligations, if you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the concern was simply to avoid, there was two issues. One, to avoid providing any technologies that could be considered dual use, and that can go very far. You can consider a simple filter of seeds to be used in some technologies that could be military. A laser that measures the level of water could be used as perceived as a laser, which could be utilized for military purposes. So that's one dimension. And the second dimension was the fact that the capacity of the state was seen in doubt, capacity of the state to, if you will, deliver on its obligation within a context that was the proper good governance context, let me put it this way, to use UNDP jargon, a good governance approach, and therefore, not being sure of it, it was better to provide humanitarian aid directly to the people and avoid building the capacity of the state to the extent possible. Having said that, nurses had to be trained and doctors had to be trained, but one would want to work as much as possible for assistance that would aid the people.
Interesting. Thank you, Jerome, for that. Finally, we have online Ms. Eun Kyung-kwon, an experienced human rights activist with years of experience on advocating for human rights and democracy in the DPRK. She currently serves as the executive director of the Network for North Korean Democracy and Human Rights, also known as NKNet, and is the Secretary General of the Secretariat of the International Coalition to Stop Crimes Against Humanity in North Korea. Amongst her previous experience is a key role in advocating for the 2013 UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the DPRK, and then subsequently supporting its investigation. So you're extremely well placed to provide the final presentation for this panel on the dual approach towards human rights in the DPRK. So over to you.
Thank you, Daniel, for your kind introducing me. And I will share with this presentation. Just a second. Okay. Thank you for this opportunity to give a presentation about our activities. I'm going to talk about the accountability and the constructive engagement from the perspective of civil society, focusing on the changes in North Korean human rights movement and the North Korean society. And lastly, new attempts for human rights activities of a few organizations, including my own. I will jump over these slides about the history of North Korean human rights movements, but later on, if you want, I will share it with you if you ask me. And also these activities are all kind of our activities that the people and audience here in this place have already experienced and carried out by ourselves. Okay, here. There have been changes in North Korean human rights movement, while changes in North Korean society were also found. The slide is about the changes in North Korea that escapees who recently came to South Korea told me. Of course, these changes are not at satisfactory level of improvement we expect. However, it can be seen that the stories of escapees who experienced the 2010s are very different from the testimonies of those who left North Korea in early 2000s. Just after experiencing the arduous march, I met about 20 North Korean escapees who left the country between 2017 and early 2020. A person who left North Korea in 2019 and used to be an official at the Ministry of Social Security told me that a decree not to bring about a problem about human rights has been handed down around 2014 without specific details on what human rights problems. A woman in her mid-70s at the time who came to South Korea in early 2020 from a remote village in Yangon province was a chairwoman of Inminban said that she heard a word, human rights. The authorities said that since the UN irritated us with human rights, we should be careful about it. Also, it is known that Hwaryong Gwaliso camp number 22 was closed in 2012, and Yodo Gwaliso number 15 was also dismantled in 2014, but reportedly consolidated into other camps such as Gwaliso in Gyecheon. Of course, we can't interpret this closure of two camps positively as long as the Gwaliso systems are still operating in North Korea. Nevertheless, it seems a result of COI investigation and the pressure of naming and shaming, which is one track for North Korean human rights improvement. Let's see the changes in North Korea through private economy activities. In the early 2000s, people's survival instinct drove female economic players into 장마당 activities, and private capital has gathered around money masters or private entrepreneurs, and the private economic sector has been vitalized in a social area where the authority cannot completely control their administrative system or power. The circumstances has improved people's livelihood. For instance, it can be seen that freedom of movement has been solved in some extent by registering a truck under a state institution, but operating privately as a service car, sobicha in North Korean, as a kind of public transportation in the gray market, which works in a gap between illegal and legal economic area. The issuance of travel permission for the inter-province travel has been simplified by giving a bribe. There is also a way to overcome discrimination based on the family background called 성분 or 토대 by paying bribes. In other words, if you have money and a network with higher officials, even rural residents can register as a resident in a larger cities. Of course, such changes doesn't solve fundamental human rights problems. However, it is a social phenomenon that has emerged between the measures for survival found by the people themselves and the policies for economic development planned by the North Korean authorities. We need to strategically utilize such a phenomenon. In that regard, it should be recognized that the perception of the North Korean authorities should be different depending on the approaches of North Korean human rights agendas. The North Korean authorities could be the main player in solving human rights problems or improving people's livelihood. Of course, in the case of international criminal trial to ensure accountability for crimes against humanity, some individuals of North Korean authorities could be the accused. The perception of the North Korean authorities must be recognized in various ways in accordance with the various strategies for improving human rights. For example, my organization, using these mechanisms, and wait a sec, where? Okay, here. Yeah. For example, my organization did a research about widespread exploitation in North Korea, which was to look into North Korean mechanisms and practices to exploit property, labor, and bribes from the people. I found several ideal approaches to solving human rights problems, even though they are practical but probably unrealistic for now. According to the Vienna report, to ensure living conditions and environment for a more affluent and civilized life, North Korean authorities plan to build 50,000 dwellings in Pyongyang, but regime mobilizes people's labor without giving wages. and collect construction resources from the people, insisting that the people voluntarily apply for the construction and offer themselves with full loyalty to the party. It seems forced labor, violation of the right to enjoy an adequate standard of living and to choose an occupation as they want, discrimination, etc. Moreover, in the case of Dolgyokdae involvement, the military-style construction brigade, it could be enslavement that should be held accountable at a trial. Therefore, I'd like to suggest that North Korean authorities find a solution in their policies by forming a job recruitment center under the People's Committee to give construction jobs to day laborers, which are nominally non-exist in North Korea. At the same time, if North Korea could allow small-sized cottage industries that would be registered under the People's Committee, benefits from the small factories as a quasi-tax could be given to the day laborers in a form of salary. For the freedom of information activity, such policy suggestions will become useful contents for North Korean tailored documentaries, which can be a practical way to make a solidarity with the North Korean people, as Rapporteur Salmon just mentioned. As human rights problems are diverse, various tracks to improve human rights are necessary. Not only the use of North Korean human rights mechanisms, but discourse on economic development is also needed to achieve the SDGs within the scope of UN sanctions against North Korea. More importantly, the activity of creating and disseminating customized content to North Korea is a significant track so that North Korean can understand the values of democracy, human rights, and the market economy that we enjoy. Civic society and civic group in South Korea have recently been interested in the SDGs. There is not quite much that we can do directly to achieve North Korea's SDGs, but advocacy for human rights-based economic exchanges and right to development will be possible for international organizations cooperating with North Korea in near future. This activity is still in its infancy, so it is at a level of thinking about the strategies and forming a network with relevant parties. Crucial track is for ensure accountability. I'll pass this slide for time limit, and our experts also in this place have already explained. And one of the reasons why we need more diverse tracks is because there have been some changes in economic policies compared with previous times. Amendment to Constitution in April 2019 omitted the 대한 business system, 대한의 사업체계, which was the core of the socialist economic operation method to follow the political guidance made by Kim Il-sung, but instead specified the socialist corporate responsibility management system, which was introduced at the 7th Party Congress in 2016. Additionally, there are identical plans for development in the report on the fourth plenary meeting of 8th Central Committee of the Workers' Party of this year, the 5-year National Development Plan, and the contents of the Vienna report submitted to the SDGs High-Level Political Forum in last year in June. Of course, these policies are not all positive signals for North Korean human rights improvement, but we need to take advantage of North Korean plans and policies for our cause in strategic views. Lastly, but most importantly, we need to understand the younger generation's awareness in North Korea. There are noticeable differences between the generation born after the arduous march and the older generation who experienced the previous time before the famine. The young generation, which we call 장마당 generation, has grown up with market power, but not received any welfare benefits and proper education from the authorities. Therefore, they have indifference to politics, ideology, and a lack of loyalty to the party. Due to the market activities to survive, they've ascertained awareness of the rudimentary stage of free market economy. They don't have collectivism and have no sense of social community. They have strong individual selfishness and mammonism, thus lacking awareness of rule of law, which are different points from their parents' generation. It means we need more innovative approaches to convince the 장마당 generation. The strategies for the human rights movement that we used in the 1990s and early 2000s will not work for major new generation in North Korea, which could be the actual conclusion of my presentation. Given such changes, there are new attempts in the movement. A few organizations research to seek improvement measures whilst pursuing normalization of the country from a long-term perspective, as well as a study of realistic and down-to-earth policy guidelines to improve people's livelihood. The examples are like this on this slide. And in conclusion, having long-term strategies, we need to develop contents for external information dissemination for North Koreans to be introduced to values on human rights, democracy, the rule of law, free market economy, civilization, and values of rationality, while being prepared to ensure accountability for crimes against humanity. I'll end my presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kwan. Some interesting thoughts, including on the issue of economic, social, cultural rights, and how do we engage with the younger generation as well and adapt our strategies. So we have around 15 minutes left for some questions from the floor. So if you have a question, if you could just raise your hand, mention your name and organization, and if you could keep the question as concise as possible, that would be much appreciated. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Front. Do you have a microphone?
안녕하세요. 저는 Justice for North Korea 필호정.
I'm from Justice for North Korea. My name is Pil-ho Jung. I have a question to Mr. Imesh Pokar. So the Korean society and Korean government, whenever the administration changed, its attitude towards North Korea has changed. The unification, Ministry of Unification and Justice, depending on the ruling party, have not shown consistency in their policy towards North Korea. Perhaps a national human and the National Human Rights Institution, which is an independent institution, is also not consistent. And also, as Professor Peck said, the victims. There are 30,000 victims here in South Korea and more than 6,000 people all across the world. And they're raising their voices, but their voices is still not being heard correctly. So at the UN or the OHCHR Seoul office, if they can, under the UN norm or international norm, can suggest to the Korean government that they should pursue a consistent policy, What kind of role do you, or what kind of role have you played so far, and what are your future plans for that going forward?
Should we take any more? A couple more questions so we can deal? Yeah, at the front here again.
네. 성공적인 통일을 만들어가는 사람들, PS 코어 남바다 사무국장입니다.
I am Nam from PS Corps. So I have a question for
발표하실 때
Jerome Sauvage.
그 발표하실 때
So in your presentation, you said that you worked on human rights issue, but you couldn't actually really do human rights work due to the limitations that you faced in North Korea, and I really resonated with that. Now,
취약한 계층의 인권을
the UN
증진하는 데는 도움이 되지만
programs are helpful in enhancing the rights of the people who are vulnerable, but it does have its limitations in talking about with the top government officials about this issue. So, to what extent can you actually mention about this issue of human rights to North Korean officials, and what kind of measures can you actually take in a practical manner? And have you seen any political improvements happening, even partially, in North Korea when you talk to them?
And we'll take one more just behind. Just, yep.
Yes, great thanks to all discussants and participants, discussants and panelists for your great and insightful discussion. My name is Yoon Hee Kim from National Democratic Institute, and my question goes to Special Rapporteur Salmon. And I know that you've had a lot of meetings with stakeholders in this community, including CSOs and escapees and their families. And I'm wondering if all these meetings that you have had, have this meeting make you change your initial thought or ideas of approaching North Korea human rights? By approach, I don't mean just the principal approach of constructive engagement and accountability, rather your personal angle or thought, like bringing your expertise in women's or the girls' rights into North Korean human rights. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. So first of all, maybe Imesh, you can answer the question on the lack of consistency in raising human rights issues, how it's politicized. Some administrations have one approach and another. What role can the office play in addressing that politicization?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I think we all have noticed that, particularly with the member states, depending on the governments and who wins, the policy towards the DPRK has always been either engagement or sometimes strategic patience, or sometimes not doing anything. So I think that has been one of the concerns for the international community, because there is a lack of consistency in terms of the approach towards the North Korea, whether it's be denuclearization or security or human rights. For the office, we have been, if you have seen for the past many years, and even after the establishment of the OHCHR Seoul office, we have been consistently saying, and in our public advocacy, the need for both engagement and to ensure that the accountability for the past violations has to be done, and as the High Commissioner even said yesterday, the importance of the peace process and engagement is important for promoting the human rights agenda on the Korean Peninsula. With regards to the victims' engagement, we have been, of course, I think it might not be ideal, but we have tried our best to engage as much as we can with the victims. We are undertaking consultations, as I mentioned earlier, with the sole purpose to reach out more to the victims, understand what they exactly want, and tailor the programs or advocacy based on what they say. Of course, we are not going to reach to whole 30,000 this year, but it's a small step, and we plan to reach to as much victims community as well as DPRK citizens living both in the ROK and elsewhere. So I would end it there.
Thank you. The second question from PS Core to Jerome, to expand a bit more on the extent to which you could mention human rights issues when you were working in country, to provide a bit of a fuller picture on how that looked in reality when you were trying to subtly pursue human rights objectives in your work. Over to you.
Yes, it is a tricky question, of course, but you can share international best practices coming from the rest of the international community when you speak with your North Korean counterpart. They expect from you that you will speak on behalf of what I would call the international community. You should not withdraw from this responsibility. What you hope is to empower the people that you are talking with so that they in turn can continue to carry the message that integrating human rights with development and humanitarian aid may bring benefits to the country. In a way, this is a practical approach of direct everyday engagement. You do not withdraw from your responsibility, you do not forget to speak about human rights, but you know that you will not see improvements immediately. It will happen away from your eyes. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerome. And the final question was to Elizabeth. Was asking, having actually come here on your first visit, you've met with some victims, I understand, already. Just to talk a bit about how your perspective, ideas have perhaps changed through the course of meeting and speaking to some of the victims.
Well, thank you very much for your question. I'm having a hectic week with a lot of meetings, so I need time to balance everything. But for the time being, I think that what I have already thought about the necessity to focus on specific groups and on specific and relevant topics is still in my mind. I have a number of meetings with SKPs in the Hannah Won Center with two young ladies who had spent awful things. And so I think that at this stage, at least, I think it is still necessary to try to change some practices, which is very difficult, try to find some spaces of dialogue, not to forget the accountability agenda. I think it's very important. But at the same time, I have the impression that what we could do during these next months, probably, is to raise awareness of the situation in the DPRK. We need to provide a voice, a face, to highlight the situation there. My impression is that the current situation in the world is so difficult that the problem, the situation of the DPRK is not in the front. So we need to provide some visibility to this. Thank you.
And you'll be presenting your first report in October to the General Assembly, so that will also be, I guess, an opportunity to reflect on the visit, and so keep your eyes open for the release of that report. And will you be going to New York to present the report to the General Assembly? Yeah. Umesh, did you want to? Yeah. So I think we have only 1 minute left, so I think we should probably end the session here. But thank you everybody for coming, and to the participants, thank you very much.
네, 그럼 이상으로 세션 7-1을
That
마치도록
concludes session
하겠습니다.
7-1.
다음 세션은 오후 1시
Next session will
30분부터
begin at
시작될
1:30
예정이오니 많은
p.m.
관심 부탁드리겠습니다.
We ask for your
감사합니다.
interest and participation. Thank you.